I need you to hear this before the world convinces you that it was never real, because there is a moment in every story where silence stops being protection and becomes the very wound it was trying to prevent. I have carried this silence for longer than I should have, not because the words were missing, not because the feeling wasn't there, but because the truth I have been holding always felt heavier than the risk of losing you. That is the first thing I need you to understand. Sometimes the hardest thing a person can admit is not that they love someone. The hardest thing is admitting how afraid they are of what that love could take from them. Because when you truly care about someone, you stop protecting only your own heart. You start carrying something fragile that belongs to another person too. I have spent years building things that could survive pressure, criticism, failure, uncertainty. But when it came to you, I realized I was afraid of one simple thing. I was afraid that the one person who mattered most would see every part of me I tried to hide and decide it was too much. Decide I was not enough. Have you ever looked at someone you love and wondered if they would still choose you if they knew everything? Not the version of you that smiles when it matters. Not the version that looks composed in a room full of people. Not the version that always knows what to say. I mean the version that lies awake, replaying old conversations. The version that regrets things it cannot undo. The version that wants to reach out and then stops, afraid the message will land too late, or land wrong, or simply not land at all. That is the person I have needed you to see. Not the image, not the achievements, not the things people assume they already know about me. Just the person underneath, still trying to understand why the thought of losing you feels different from every other loss I have known. Because losing something you built can hurt. Losing an opportunity can hurt. Losing a dream can hurt in its own quiet way. But losing someone who made you feel understood, in a world that so often makes you feel invisible, that is a different kind of ache. That one changes something structural inside you. And I don't know if you ever noticed the moments when I almost said everything. I almost reached out. I almost stopped pretending I had it together. And then the old fear returned, the way it always did. The fear that my honesty would become a weight for you to carry. The fear that my feelings were arriving at the wrong time, in the wrong season of your life. The fear that you had already started building a future where I had no place in it. Tell me something. Have you ever cared about someone so much that you became afraid of disturbing their peace? Have you ever wanted to say, please stay, but swallowed the words because saying them felt like handing someone a weapon? That is the place I have been standing, caught between two impossible choices. One choice was protecting myself. The other was risking everything by finally telling you what you mean to me. And somewhere in that in-between space, I learned something painful. Sometimes protecting your heart means losing the very person your heart was trying to protect. I don't want this to become another story where two people cared deeply but waited too long. Where pride spoke louder than love. Where fear outlasted honesty. Where two people walked away convinced they were doing the right thing, only to spend years wondering what might have happened if either of them had been brave for just one moment. Maybe you wondered why I seemed distant sometimes. Maybe you assumed it meant I didn't care. Maybe my silence read to you like uncertainty. But the truth is that people don't always go quiet because they feel nothing. Sometimes they go quiet because they feel far too much, and they don't yet trust themselves to say it out loud without it breaking apart in their hands. I know that sounds backwards, because the world teaches us that love should always announce itself. That if someone loves you, they won't hesitate, won't struggle, won't be afraid. But real love rarely arrives as a clean, perfect moment. Sometimes real love is standing in front of someone you value and realizing your greatest fear isn't rejection. Your greatest fear is being accepted, and still somehow failing them anyway. That fear has followed me for a long time. The fear of promising something beautiful and not having the strength to protect it. The fear of becoming one more person who enters someone's life with words, and leaves them holding only the wreckage of those words. I never wanted to be that person to you. I never wanted you to feel like a chapter in someone else's story, because you were never ordinary to me. You were the person who made me question the parts of myself I thought I already understood. You taught me, without ever trying to, that success can fill a room, but it cannot replace the one person who looks at you and actually sees the human being underneath everything you've built. And maybe that is exactly why this has been so hard to say. Because when someone matters this much, every sentence feels like it carries weight. Every confession feels like a door that once opened can never fully close again. Every piece of truth changes something permanently. I want you to know this before I go any further. I haven't been hiding because I don't trust you. I have been hiding because I do. I trust you enough to know your reaction would actually matter to me, and that terrified me. Because the moment someone's opinion has the power to break your heart, you realize exactly how much power you've handed them. You become exposed in a way no accomplishment can shield you from. And maybe you're asking, if you cared this much, why did you wait? That question has followed me for longer than I want to admit. Why did I let the days stack up between us? Why did I let the distance grow instead of closing it? Why did I convince myself, over and over, that silence was the safer choice? The answer isn't simple. It's something I've struggled to admit even alone, in the quiet, where there was no one left to perform for. There is a difference between loving someone and believing you're entitled to be loved back by them, and for a long time I confused those two things. I knew exactly how much I cared for you. What I didn't know was whether I had any right to ask you to feel the same. I was afraid of becoming your responsibility instead of your choice. I was afraid you might stay out of guilt or pity rather than desire. And I never wanted your love to come from obligation. I wanted it to come from freedom, from certainty, from the quiet decision that even knowing my flaws, you would still choose me anyway. That is the kind of love I believe is worth fighting for. Not the version that only survives when everything is easy. Not the version that dissolves the moment life becomes complicated. I mean the kind that watches the storm arrive and still turns to ask, are we facing this together? So before you decide what my silence meant, before you assume my hesitation was proof I didn't feel anything, I need you to know there was always more happening beneath the surface than you could see. There was always a reason I pulled back. There was always a reason I stopped myself right before the words came out. And I still haven't told you the real reason. Maybe when you finally hear it, you'll understand why this confession took so long to reach you. Maybe you'll be angry. Maybe you'll feel like I should have told you years ago. Maybe you'll wonder how I let something this important stay buried for so long. And if you feel that way, I understand. If I were standing where you are, I might ask the very same questions. But before you judge the silence, I need you to remember something. The heart doesn't always move at the speed of courage. Sometimes it moves at the speed of fear, and fear is a slower, heavier thing to outrun. Sometimes it simply takes longer for a person to admit what they've already known for years. And what I've known, underneath every excuse and every delay, is this. There was never a single moment where you were just a passing thought to me. You were never someone I could forget because life got busy. You were never someone I could trade for whatever looked easier. The more I told myself that walking away would protect us both, the more I understood I was only running from the one conversation that could have finally set us free. So let me ask you something. If you knew someone loved you but was too afraid to show it, would you wait for them to find their courage? Or would you assume their silence meant they never cared at all? If someone stood in front of you carrying years of unspoken feeling, would you read their hesitation as weakness? Or would you recognize that the deepest emotions are often the hardest ones for a person to reveal? I'm asking because I don't want to lose you to a misunderstanding. I don't want our story to end simply because I was too afraid to tell you the truth while there was still time to tell it. I want you to know that behind every moment I seemed far away, there was a battle happening that you never saw. Behind every time I changed the subject, there was a confession sitting right at the edge of my mouth. Behind every goodbye that felt too casual, there was a part of me hoping quietly that you'd notice I didn't actually want to leave. And if you're still here, still listening, if some part of you senses that something between us was left unfinished, then maybe you already understand why I needed to say all of this. There are so many reasons people walk away from love. Sometimes it's timing, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's pride. Sometimes people simply convince themselves that losing someone slowly in pieces is easier than risking losing them all at once. But I don't want to live that way anymore. I don't want to look back one day and realize I protected myself from pain, but sacrificed the one connection that made me feel most alive. I don't want to spend years wondering whether one honest conversation could have changed everything. I don't want regret to become the only place left where I can still find you. If these words are reaching you at the right moment, I hope you understand they aren't coming from someone who has life figured out. They're coming from someone who finally accepted that love asks for a different kind of courage. The courage to be seen exactly as you are. The courage to sit in uncertainty without running from it. The courage to admit that one person can matter enough to make even the steadiest heart afraid. If any part of this feels like it was written for you, stay with me a little longer, because there's something I've carried quietly for a long time, and I need you to understand it fully before I go any further. The truth I've been circling isn't only that I love you. The truth is that I loved you in a way that frightened me, because loving you meant I had to give up control of the outcome. I could not guarantee you would stay. I could not guarantee you would understand. I could not guarantee that handing you my heart would end the way I hoped it would. And that might be the hardest lesson real love ever teaches. You can offer someone your honesty. You can offer your loyalty, your devotion, your deepest feelings laid bare. But you cannot force anyone to choose you back. That choice has to remain entirely free, untouched by pressure or guilt, or it isn't really love at all. It's just fear wearing love's clothing. And maybe that's what makes love both beautiful and unbearable at once. The person who matters most to you is also the one person with the power to hurt you the most completely. But despite that fear, I've come to understand something else. A heart that never risks anything is also a heart that never truly lives. I did not want to spend the rest of my life avoiding pain if the price of that avoidance was missing something real. I did not want to become someone who had everything except the courage to love, because success without real connection becomes its own quiet, echoing kind of loneliness. A person can be surrounded by people and still feel completely unseen. A person can receive admiration from 100 directions and still lie awake wondering if anyone actually knows who they are underneath it all. And when I think of you, I think of how rare it is to be understood without needing to explain every detail of yourself first. That kind of understanding isn't something people find easily. It isn't something anyone should take for granted, and for a while, I nearly did. I nearly treated something precious as though it would simply always be there, waiting, unchanged, no matter how long I ignored it. That was my mistake. We assume the people who matter most to us will always understand our silence, that they'll wait patiently while we work up the nerve to speak. But they are human too. They carry their own doubts, their own fears, their own quiet moments of wondering whether they are valued at all. And maybe there were nights when you questioned your place in my life. Maybe you wondered if you truly mattered to me. Maybe you noticed how I could show conviction in almost every other part of my life, and yet hesitate the moment it came to you. And maybe that contradiction hurt more than my actual silence did. I wish I could travel back and explain everything in those exact moments. I wish I could have told you clearly. My silence was never about you being unimportant. It was about you being important enough to frighten me into stillness. But time doesn't move backward, no matter how badly we wish it would. We only ever get the present moment, and in this one, I need you to know what I finally understood. The greatest risk was never telling you the truth. The greatest risk was losing you while I carried that truth completely alone, because secrets don't protect love forever. Eventually they harden into walls, and walls can separate even two people who desperately want to be close to one another. I spent so long constructing walls around my heart that I forgot what a heart is actually for. It isn't meant to stay protected behind stone, it's meant to connect, to feel, to choose even when choosing is terrifying. And choosing you was the one decision I kept postponing, because I knew it would change everything, not because it guaranteed happiness, but because it demanded honesty, and honesty rearranges the furniture of a life permanently. Once you tell someone the truth, you can't slip back into pretending. Once you admit what someone means to you, you lose the shelter of distance. Once you say you matter to me, you become responsible for treating that person as though they actually do matter, every single day, not just in the moments that are convenient. And that responsibility is beautiful. It is also frightening, because love isn't only a feeling, it's a series of decisions, made again and again, especially when emotions get complicated. It's choosing someone even when life becomes inconvenient. It's staying present when escape would be so much easier. There was a stretch of time when I believed I had already lost you. A stretch when I was certain my hesitation had built too much distance to cross back over. A moment when I wondered if I was only finding my courage because it was already too late to use it. That thought broke something loose in me, because I realized I wasn't afraid of rejection anymore. I was afraid of regret. I was afraid of knowing I'd had the chance to tell you and chosen silence instead. I was afraid of waking up one ordinary morning and realizing the person I had been too slow to reach had finally stopped waiting. That is a particular kind of pain that no achievement can fix. No accomplishment distracts from it. No amount of forward motion in any other part of your life replaces one unresolved truth sitting quietly in your chest. And my unresolved truth has always been you. Not because you completed some missing piece of me, not because I couldn't survive without you, but because you reminded me of the kind of person I actually wanted to become. Someone more open, someone more patient, someone more honest, even when honesty costs something. Someone willing to feel instead of constantly trying to manage and control every outcome. I think that's what real partnership actually is. It isn't finding someone who removes every obstacle from your path. It's finding someone who makes you willing to face those obstacles differently, with less armor and more truth. I don't know exactly what tomorrow holds. Nobody does, no matter how carefully they plan for it. But I want to find out with you beside me, not because it guarantees an easy road, but because the road feels different when it isn't walked alone. That was the decision I was afraid to make, and the fear was never really about you. It was about myself. I questioned whether I could give you the kind of love you actually deserve. I questioned whether my flaws would eventually become a burden you had to carry. I questioned whether my complicated, crowded life could still leave enough room for the simple, ordinary moments that end up mattering the most in the end. The quiet mornings, the unremarkable Tuesdays, the small rituals that, over time, become the architecture of a life shared with someone. There was another version of this story I almost let myself live. A version where I convinced myself distance was a form of kindness. Where I told myself letting you go was somehow respectful, a noble sacrifice rather than a fear I couldn't name. I told myself that sometimes loving someone means stepping aside so they can find a happiness that doesn't include you. But there was a crack running straight through that belief. Because I wasn't stepping aside to protect your happiness. I was stepping aside because I was afraid to discover whether I could actually be part of it. And there is a painful difference between those two things, a difference I avoided looking at directly for far too long. Have you noticed how easy it becomes to invent a noble reason for something you're actually just afraid to face head on? We tell ourselves stories because the plain truth feels too exposed, too raw to sit with. We say, I'm doing this for them, when the real, unspoken sentence is, I'm doing this because I don't know what happens if I stay and it works. I spent a long stretch convincing myself you deserved someone simpler, someone without so many responsibilities pulling at their attention. Someone whose mind wasn't constantly racing through contingencies. Someone who could offer you certainty without a single moment of hesitation. And maybe that assumption was my biggest mistake of all. I underestimated what you actually wanted. I assumed you were searching for perfection, when maybe you were only ever searching for honesty. I assumed you wanted someone without scars, when maybe you simply wanted someone brave enough to show you his. Because love is strange that way. The world insists we should present our strongest, most polished selves to the person we love. But maybe the deepest form of love is actually the opposite. Maybe it's allowing someone to witness the parts we usually keep hidden, the fears, the doubts, the moments of not knowing, the moments when we quietly need someone else to remind us we're still worth choosing. And that's exactly what you did for me, without even realizing it. You made me question the person I had built myself into. Not because you demanded I change, not because you asked me to become someone else entirely, but simply because being near someone who truly sees your heart makes it impossible to keep pretending you don't have one at all. There were nights I wanted to tell you everything. I wanted to describe the hours I spent imagining what a future between us might actually look like. I wanted to admit that certain conversations with you lingered in my mind far longer than meetings I was supposed to consider far more important. I wanted to tell you that being near you had a strange way of making the whole noisy world feel quieter, more manageable, more survivable. But every single time I came close to saying it out loud, another voice inside me interrupted with the same question. What if you tell her everything, and she realizes she can't give you what you're hoping for? That question stopped me more times than I'd like to admit, because rejection from a stranger is painful in an ordinary way. But rejection from someone who already knows your heart feels entirely different. It feels like losing a home you never got the chance to actually build, one you had only started imagining the rooms of. And I think that's what frightened me the most, in the end. Not the fear of losing a person, but the fear of losing a possibility. Losing an entire future that had only ever existed in my imagination. The small moments, the quiet conversations, the ordinary days that somehow transform into something extraordinary, simply because the right person happens to be standing beside you in them. Have you ever missed something that never officially belonged to you in the first place? Have you ever grieved a future that never actually happened? Because that's exactly where I found myself for longer than I want to admit. Missing moments we never had the chance to live, replaying conversations we never finished having, wondering what it might feel like to hold your hand through a difficult stretch of days, wondering whether you would have understood the silence hiding underneath my words, wondering whether you would have stayed, even when things became complicated. I need to be honest about something else too. There was another path I nearly took, a path that looked, from a distance, like the easier road. A path where I could sidestep uncertainty entirely. A path where I chose someone who didn't challenge the way I felt things. Someone who didn't force me to examine my own defenses. Someone who let me stay comfortable exactly where I already was. And for a stretch of time, I nearly convinced myself that comfort and love were the same thing. That was my mistake, one of the deepest ones. Because comfort asks almost nothing of you. Love asks for everything. Love asks you to be vulnerable in ways that feel unnatural at first. Love asks you to surrender the very defenses you've spent years constructing. Love asks you to stand in front of another person and say, plainly, this is who I actually am. Not the polished version, not the impressive version, not the version everyone else expects to see, but the real one, unfiltered. And then you wait. You wait to see whether they step closer, or whether they turn and walk away instead. That waiting might be one of the hardest experiences a person can go through, because no amount of success prepares you for it. No accomplishment, no recognition, no carefully maintained sense of control softens that particular kind of exposure. When it comes to love, everyone becomes human again. Everyone becomes afraid again, no matter how composed they appear from the outside. And I was more afraid than I ever wanted to let on. But something eventually shifted the way I saw all of it. A moment I never actually told you about. A moment when I realized my silence wasn't protecting anything anymore. It was slowly dismantling the very possibility it was supposed to guard. I watched the days pass. I watched the space between us widen, almost imperceptibly at first, and then not so subtly at all. And I finally had to ask myself a question I could no longer avoid. What if the person I'm working so hard not to lose has already begun learning how to live without me? That question hurt more than I expected it to. Because there's a specific kind of pain in realizing someone you love might be quietly adjusting to your absence. Maybe you stopped checking for messages from me. Maybe you stopped wondering why I'd gone quiet again. Maybe you stopped hoping I would ever finally say the thing I clearly needed to say. And if that happened, I can't blame you for it. Because people can only sit with uncertainty for so long, before even the most patient heart grows tired of waiting. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you asked yourself the exact questions I was asking myself in the dark. Does this person actually want me? Am I imagining a connection that was never really there? Should I stop holding space for someone who can't seem to decide? Those questions ache, because so often the person we end up hurting the most is the person we never intended to hurt at all. And that realization changed something fundamental in me, because I finally understood that avoiding a hard conversation doesn't prevent the pain it's meant to avoid. It only postpones it. And postponed pain has a way of growing roots, of becoming heavier and more tangled the longer it's left alone in the dark. I wish I could tell you I became fearless the moment I understood all of this. I didn't. I kept struggling, I kept second-guessing myself, I kept wondering whether I had already missed the window entirely. But there was one truth I could no longer talk myself out of. You deserve the truth. Not a polished explanation. Not a carefully rehearsed answer designed to protect how I look in your eyes. The actual truth. And the truth is that I've been carrying something far heavier than simple hesitation. Something I was afraid you would misread. Something that, if you knew it, I feared might permanently change the way you saw me. I still haven't told you the real reason behind all of this, not fully, because the real reason isn't only fear. It's tied to a promise I made to myself a long time ago, long before you and I ever crossed paths. A promise that shaped the way I love, the way I trust, the way I let anyone get close enough to matter. And I never explained it to you because I didn't know how to put words to something I barely understood myself. But I have to try now, because if I stay silent any longer, I risk losing the chance to explain it at all. There is something you should know about the moment I almost chose the easier road. I almost convinced myself another person could offer me the kind of peace I was looking for. I almost believed that a relationship without any real risk was the relationship I actually needed. I almost chose someone who made life simpler over the one person who made life feel meaningful. That truth is difficult to sit with because it means I wasn't only afraid of losing you, I was afraid of choosing you. I was afraid of everything choosing you would demand from me. It would demand honesty. It would demand change. It would demand that I stop hiding behind everything I had spent years building and finally let one person see what actually exists underneath all of it. That was the part I struggled with most. Because when the world constantly expects you to appear strong, you slowly forget how to be vulnerable at all. You forget that a heart isn't a machine. It cannot be optimized. It cannot be fully controlled. It doesn't always obey logic, no matter how carefully you try to reason with it. And you were the one thing logic could never solve for me. The one question no amount of analysis could answer. The one decision with no perfect formula attached to it. Only courage, only trust, only love, standing there stripped of certainty. But then something happened that forced me to see the possibility of losing you in an entirely different light. Something that made it clear I was standing at the edge of a decision that once made could never be undone. Because I could picture a future where you were genuinely happy, and in that picture I was no longer present. And for the first time I understood what regret actually feels like. Not regret over something you did, but regret over something you were too afraid to try. That fear became impossible to ignore, because there comes a moment in every life when you realize that avoiding a decision is, itself, a decision, one with its own permanent consequences. I reached that moment with you. I had spent so long telling myself that waiting was harmless, that silence was only temporary, that someday, once everything finally felt perfect, I would say all the things I needed to say. But life rarely hands us perfect moments. Sometimes it offers only one narrow, fragile window, one small opportunity where honesty still has the power to change the direction two hearts are moving in. And I began to understand something that frightened me deeply. Maybe I wasn't protecting our future by waiting at all. Maybe I was slowly allowing a future without us to quietly become the only possible outcome. That thought stayed with me, because I could imagine losing plenty of things and somehow finding a way through it. I could imagine rebuilding after failure. I could imagine starting over from nothing. I could imagine facing almost any challenge life put in front of me. But I could not easily imagine watching you become a stranger. Someone whose voice I once looked forward to hearing above every other sound in a room. Someone whose presence used to settle the chaos in me without either of us needing to say a word about it. Someone who knew parts of me I rarely let anyone else see. And then, suddenly, someone I was no longer permitted to reach at all. Have you ever considered that particular kind of loss? Not the dramatic the kind that ends in anger and slammed doors, but the quiet the kind where two people still care for each other deeply, yet life slowly stretches enough distance between them that neither one remembers how to find their way back. That kind of loss is its own quiet horror, because there's no villain in it, no one clearly to blame. Just two people who happen to be afraid at exactly the same time, in exactly the same silence. And I never wanted us to become that story. I never wanted us to be two people who years later looked back and wondered why neither of us found the courage to simply speak. So here's what I need to say plainly. The truth I was protecting was never that I didn't love you. The truth was that I loved you in a way that genuinely frightened me, because loving you meant surrendering control over how the story would end. I could not guarantee you would stay. I could not guarantee you would understand any of this. I could not guarantee that handing you my heart would lead anywhere close to the ending I quietly hoped for. And maybe that is the hardest lesson love ever teaches anyone. You can offer someone your honesty, you can offer someone your loyalty, you can offer your deepest, most guarded feelings, but you cannot force another person to choose you in return. That choice has to remain entirely theirs, entirely free, or it stops being love and becomes something else entirely. And maybe that's exactly what makes love both so beautiful and so painful at once. The person who matters to you most is also always the person who holds the most power to hurt you completely. But despite that fear, I came to understand something important. A heart that never risks anything never truly lives either. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life avoiding pain if the price of that avoidance was missing something real and irreplaceable. I didn't want to become someone who had everything except the courage required to love fully. Because success without real connection eventually curdles into its own quiet, hollow kind of loneliness. A person can be surrounded by admiration and still feel completely unseen underneath it. A person can be applauded and still privately wonder if anyone actually knows who they really are. And when I think of you, I think of how rare it is to feel understood without needing to explain every part of yourself first. How rare it is to sit in silence with someone and have that silence feel like understanding instead of distance. That kind of connection isn't something people stumble into easily, and it isn't something anyone should take lightly once they've found it. I nearly did anyway. I nearly treated something precious as though it would simply wait forever, unchanged, no matter how long I left it unattended. That was my mistake, and I own it fully now, without excuses left to hide behind. We assume the people who matter most will always understand our silences, that they'll patiently wait out our hesitation without ever doubting how they're valued. But they're human too, carrying their own private fears, their own quiet nights of wondering where they stand. And maybe there were evenings when you questioned your place in my life. Maybe you wondered whether you truly mattered, or whether I was simply someone who found it easy to show conviction everywhere except with you. I wish I could travel backward and explain everything clearly, in real time, instead of arriving with this explanation only now, so much later than it should have come. I wish I could have told you sooner. My silence was never about your importance being small. It was about your importance being enormous enough to frighten someone who thought he'd already made peace with fear. Time doesn't move backward, no matter how much we wish it could rewind for us. We only ever get the present, the moment directly in front of us, and in this moment, here now, I need you to know exactly what I've come to understand. The greatest risk was never telling you the truth. The greatest risk, the one I nearly let win, was losing you while I carried that truth completely alone. In silence, behind a wall I built brick by careful brick without ever noticing how tall it had grown. Because secrets don't protect love indefinitely. Eventually they harden into walls, and walls have a way of separating even two people who desperately want to close the distance between them. I spent far too long constructing defenses around my own heart, and somewhere in that process, I forgot what a heart is actually meant to do. It isn't built to stay sealed away behind stone. It's built to connect, to feel fully even when feeling is uncomfortable, to choose even when choosing terrifies you down to your bones. And choosing you was the one decision I kept quietly postponing, because I knew somewhere underneath all my excuses that it would change absolutely everything. Not because it guaranteed a happy ending, but because it required honesty, and honesty has a way of rearranging a life permanently, without asking permission first. Once you tell someone the truth, there's no slipping back into the comfort of pretending. Once you admit what someone means to you, the shelter of distance disappears completely. Once you say the words, "You matter to me" out loud, you become responsible for proving it, not just in grand gestures, but in the smaller, quieter, more ordinary moments that actually make up a life. And that responsibility is beautiful in its own demanding way. It is also frightening because love was never only a feeling to begin with. It's a long, continuous series of decisions, made again and again, especially in the moments when emotions get complicated and clarity feels impossible to reach. It's choosing someone even when life becomes inconvenient. It's staying present when escape would clearly be the easier option. I need to admit one more thing before I let this rest. There was a stretch of time when I genuinely believed I had already lost you. A stretch when I was convinced my hesitation had carved too wide a canyon between us to ever cross back over. A moment when I wondered whether I was only finding the courage to speak now because it was already far too late for it to matter. That thought broke something loose inside me because I understood, clearly, that I wasn't afraid of rejection anymore. I was afraid of regret. I was afraid of knowing for the rest of my life that I'd had the chance to tell you and had chosen silence instead. I was afraid of waking one ordinary morning and discovering that the person I had been too slow to reach had quietly, finally stopped waiting for me altogether. That is a particular kind of pain no achievement can repair. No accomplishment distracts from it for long. No amount of forward motion elsewhere in life replaces one unresolved truth sitting heavy in your chest, waiting to be spoken. And my unresolved truth has always been you. Not because you completed some missing part of me, not because I couldn't survive without you standing somewhere nearby, but because you reminded me simply by being who you are, of the kind of person I actually wanted to grow into. Someone more open, someone more patient, someone more honest, even when honesty comes at a cost. Someone willing to feel things fully instead of constantly trying to manage and contain every possible outcome in advance. I believe that's what real partnership actually is, underneath all the noise and expectation the world attaches to it. It isn't finding someone who removes every obstacle from your path before you even encounter it. It's finding someone who makes you willing to face those obstacles differently, with less armor, less performance, and far more truth than you're used to offering anyone. I don't know exactly what comes next. No one really does, no matter how carefully they plan or how confidently they speak about the future. But I want to find out what comes next with you standing somewhere nearby. Not because that guarantees an easy road ahead, but because even the hardest roads feel different when you're not walking them entirely alone. And if you've read this far, if some quiet part of you recognized something familiar in these words, then maybe you already understand exactly why I needed to say all of it, finally, without holding anything back. I don't know what happens next between us. I don't know if this arrives at the right moment, or if too much time has already slipped by. But I know that staying silent any longer was never going to protect either of us. It was only ever going to guarantee the very loss I was so afraid of in the first place. So this is me, finally choosing honesty over comfort. This is me finally choosing you, out loud, without the walls I hid behind for far too long. And whatever you decide to do with these words now that they're finally spoken, I needed you to know at last exactly what has been living quietly underneath all that silence.